What makes a serial killer? What drives them towards sadistic murder?
There are many, many reasons why a person can end up being evil.
What are the roots of their cold-blooded brutality?
Hitting this woman over the head with a metal pipe, slashing her neck to cut her head off. He lost complete control of what he was doing.
Was it the result of an abusive childhood? Or was it hardwired from birth?
It's been questioned now over 250 years. Is someone born a criminal? Is someone made a criminal?
Now, cutting-edge research takes us on a dark and dangerous thrill ride. A remarkable journey coming face to face with pure evil and venturing inside the criminal mind. They may appear to be ordinary, your next-door neighbor. In reality, they're far from it. What they all have in common is an unquenchable thirst for murder, with a total lack of remorse. They are the embodiment of brutal inhumanity. They are serial killers.
For someone like Jeffrey Dahmer, who not only killed but cannibalized his victims, he received such gratification from that he continued to do it over and over and over again, and likely would have done it forever until he had been caught.
Their names are seared into our collective consciousness as symbols of unthinkable terror. Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Joel Rifkin, Jeffrey Dahmer. Their heinous deeds immortalized by their fearsome nicknames: Son of Sam, the Zodiac Killer, Green River Murderer, and the BTK Strangler. Bind, torture, kill.
We've seen cases in which individuals are held, kidnapped, held in dungeons, held in basements. Every aspect of their lives are controlled by the individuals who are their captors, which is completely motivated by a gratification, a need for control, a need for dominance.
Since Jack the Ripper terrorized London in the 1880s, criminologists and forensic scientists have searched for keys to unlock the twisted psyche of these monsters.
It's a very complicated question. It's a tremendous combination of things, and there are many, many reasons why a person can end up being evil.
In the 1970s, the Federal Bureau of Investigation added psychological profiling to their arsenal of tools to capture these killers. Patrick Mullaney and Howard Teeton led the first profiling unit.
Psychological profiling in the FBI began with the opening of the new FBI Academy in the early 1970s. Howard Teeton and I started profiling cases, and we then came to the realization damn, we're onto something good. And we continued it and then broadened it and brought in new people as profilers and actually started teaching it.
What were the common threads between these murderers? What initially set them off down the road to become serial killers?
There's no one course that makes an individual turn into or becoming criminals. There's no one individual path. There's different things you want to look at, and that one is the family dynamics, the relationship with the family, the mother, the father, the relationship the mother and the father have with themselves.
When you take a look at the development of serial killers, oftentimes they come from homes that are quite broken. They come from homes where you see a dominant mother and an absent father. And it always is intriguing in serial killers that the father influence seems to be missing in their early years, and there's some sort of a revulsion to the dominant mother image, which is later on taken out on women during the course of their lives.
Research showed that as children, they suffered significant abuse. Sometimes psychological, sometimes physical, often sexual. There was usually a long history of psychiatric problems, criminal behavior, and alcoholism within the family.
Often they might share disrupted or broken childhoods in the sense that their family lives, their socialization patterns are atypical, they're not common. Perhaps family breakdown, family violence, all those sorts of things.
In the 1960s, forensic psychologist J.M. MacDonald popularized the idea that there are 3 behavioral red flags that serial killers exhibited during childhood. It was dubbed the MacDonald Triangle.
And there's the thing that they refer to as the triad of the homicidal personality. One element is bedwetter. Another element is fire setter. And the last is animal killer. And those 3 things will give any person studying an individual a real lead on to how they have turned violent.
The MacDonald Triangle applied to some serial killers. Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and Dennis Rader were all known to have tortured and killed animals in childhood. But the theory lost credibility as research evolved.
Actually, the sample he used were people who threatened to act violently. It didn't even include people who acted violently. But that became popular culture, that if you're a bedwetter and if you set fires and if you're cruel to animals, you have a high propensity to become a serial homicide offender. There's no link to that. And you want to be careful in using those as simple demarcation points for a variety of reasons, cultural and otherwise, to say, well, that person's going to become a serial killer.
The homicidal triad was superseded by behavioral studies that theorized that the serial killer's dysfunctional childhood created a cold-hearted lack of empathy.
Part of the development of empathy comes through modeling from the parents and also seeing how the mother and father interact with each other. You have to have the ability to develop relationships. If you do not have that chance to develop relationships, it's very hard to develop empathy or remorse.
Lack of empathy is a primary characteristic of a psychopath. This absence of concern for others and the effects of their actions on them. Certainly, not all psychopaths are criminals, but it is frequently a trait of serial killers. The FBI explains psychopathy as a personality disorder manifested in people who use a mixture of charm, manipulation, intimidation, and occasionally violence to control others and satisfy their own selfish needs.
Psychopaths are generally very rare, which is a good thing. We don't want to have too many psychopaths run around. Generally is that there's an emotional absence in the relationships, or they don't feel emotions the way others do. They interact in a very superficial, charming, manipulative, deceptive manner. There's the absence of remorse. So it's a combination of the emotional, the interpersonal, and the behavioral coming together.
Ted Bundy, one of the most notorious serial killers in North America, was born to a single mother and brought up by her parents. He grew up surrounded by lies. Bundy was told he was the adopted son of his grandparents, and his mother was his sister. As an adult, he was extremely confused about his own identity and is considered a classic psychopath. Bundy murdered over 30 young women and compared his serial killing to stamp collecting. Another common trait of serial killers is known as paraphilia, abnormal sexual behaviors or impulses characterized by intense and recurring sexual fantasies and urges. These behaviors have been linked to victims of sexual abuse as children. Lust serial murder is sometimes an outgrowth of paraphilia.
We know that fantasy plays a very important role in some offenders. They think in their heads about the kinds of sex that they want, or the kind of ideal victim that they want, and the sorts of things that they might want to do with that victim.
The infamous murderer and cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer claims to have been sexually abused by his neighbor when he was 10 years old. His parents were in conflict and divorced when he was 17. His mother and father moved out, leaving Dahmer alone with his growing paranoia and terrible fantasies in what had been his family home.
Clearly what's operating there is what we would tend to call these days a paraphilia. That kind of sexual preference may not emerge until, the teens, early teens or late teens, and that's partly might be derived from experimentation and so on. And it might also produce different kinds of emotional reactions. So the teenage years, the years when we develop our kind of courtship and our sexual relationships with others, that can be a very disturbing period, and it can of course go awry.
Because of their extreme social isolation and general hatred of the world and everyone in it, they profess to have felt suicidal as teenagers. They display a precocious interest in deviant sexuality and are obsessed with violence, voyeurism, and pornography.
Sometimes you can find nuggets of information during their juvenile years where they're entertaining these kinds of fantasies, where there's the fusion of a sexual thought with violence, and that is arousing, where that they're having this extremely violent thought or a violent thought, and it becomes sexually arousing to them.
Another frightening trait of serial killers is that often they don't look frightening at all.
Coming face to face with a serial killer will give you two experiences. First experience it will give you is the surprise that he looks so normal, and the surprise that he's talkative, polite, and oftentimes really condescending.
Contrary to the popular stereotype of a monster living somewhere in a dark corner or abandoned house, what is very striking is that they are often fathers and are even successful in life.
The background of serial killers oftentimes tracks very well with the moderate person in earnings. It's not really the poor, and very, very seldom would it be the rich. They can be well educated, but at the same token, they turn to serial killing because of an inner thrill and a fantasy that they're carrying out.
John Wayne Gacy is a case in point. A born salesman, he could talk his way in and out of any situation. He rose through a number of jobs in the early 60s, eventually managing his family's restaurant. A respected member of the community, he often performed as a clown at children's parties. Later, he earned the nickname, the Killer Clown. As a student in Seattle, Ted Bundy held a variety of part-time jobs. As part of his psychology studies, he worked as a volunteer in the city's suicide hotline center. He became involved in politics and even managed the Republican Party's Seattle campaign office.
The personality and mind of a normal person, let's call them normal person, is vastly different from a serial killer. Very, very seldom will you have a normal person fantasizing killing a human being. It just doesn't occur. The serial killer adapts a set of beliefs and patterns of action that are far, far different from what would even enter the mind of a normal person.
There seem to be various motivations that drive serial killers: fear of rejection, need for power, and a sense of inferiority.
Certainly, it's true that some serial killers are also motivated purely by anger. They're angry with particular types of people, or people in general, and they want to punish them.
We know that certain serial killers are motivated by failings in the home when they were brought up and issues in single-family parenting, pornography, sexual frustration, a need to seek acceptance which is not available to them.
John Wayne Gacy, another prolific serial killer, was abused in childhood by a family friend. He grew up under an extremely strict, despotic father and seems to have decided that he would demonstrate to his father that he was worthy of his affection. This eventually degenerated into a mad and murderous rage.
Was it the aspect of humiliation? Was it degradation? Was it power? Was it control? And with sexual sadistic offenders, they tend to engage in a behavior more as a arousal to control and dominate the individual. That's what's arousing to them, not just the pain that they inflict, the physical pain, but just the fact that they can engage in that behavior can become arousing to them.
So was it just a dreadful childhood that turned these people into serial killers? The often asked question is, why is it that two children can suffer the same terrible childhood, but one will cope and the other will kill?
That's a great question. I think that question is currently hotly debated, and it's something that it's been questioned now over about 250 years. Is someone born a criminal? Is someone made a criminal?
Cutting-edge research in the new field of neurocriminology is now trying to determine if some people are predisposed to violent behavior at birth.
There's neuroimaging studies, fMRI studies, looking at the differences between, quote, normal brains and individuals who are psychopathic. And that is a direction where we're going, and that is that there are differences in neuroanatomy.
There is some element of, if you like, biology or neurological data that tells us that some individuals may be more predisposed. And I'm thinking in particular of the recent work done by Professor Adrian Raine, looking at brain patterns between, murderers and non-murderers.
In 2013, Dr. Adrian Raine, professor of criminology at the University of Pennsylvania, released a study observing neuro and brain imaging in violent criminals, murderers, psychopaths, and serial killers. Their brains were observed to be different to those of normal people, with diminished activities in the area of the brain that are linked with self-awareness, the processing of emotions, and sensitivity to violence. As a group, the murderers had much poorer functioning in the prefrontal cortex, the area involved in regulating and controlling behavior. This is the part of the brain that Raine calls our guardian angel of behavior. If it's asleep, he says, the devil can come out. But these were the impulse killers, people who murdered in a rage, not the cold, methodical serial killers. The serial killers actually had high functioning in the prefrontal cortex, but low functioning in a deeper part of the brain called the amygdala. This is the seat of emotion involving empathy, conscience, and remorse. For them, this area was physically shrunken by 18%. This could account for why they can kill without guilt or remorse. Neurocriminologists have also found another possible biological predictor of dangerous antisocial behavior: low resting heart rate. They theorize that those with low rates don't feel fear as strongly as others. They may be more violent and take physical risks because they are less fearful of the consequences. Another theory is that life may feel a bit dull to people with low heart rates, so they seek excitement and crave intense stimulation. So the long-running question remains, is it nature or nurture? Neurocriminologists do not believe that biology is the only cause of this terrible behavior. They feel there are many factors. In a strange twist, Dr. Raine discovered that he also has low-functioning amygdala. His brain scan closely matched the scan of serial killer Randy Kraft, the scorecard killer. But Raine grew up in a loving home, and he has not turned to criminal behavior.
But I have to emphasize that almost all of the work we've done on the sort of nature versus nurture is that the nature part, of course, has a role to play, but everything seems to suggest a lot of it's to do with the way we're nurtured, the kinds of socialization, the kinds of families, the kinds of associations we develop.
And the current science is going more to neuroanatomy or the biology of crime, but I think that has yet to be written, so it probably more likely is a combination thereof, where there may be some predisposition that the person is born with, and then the environment also contributes or exacerbates those elements.
I do think there's some evidence that certain individuals may have genetic or biological risks, but no, I don't agree that people are born, bad or evil.
As scientific studies and technological advances develop, we are able to observe and understand better the inner workings of the criminal mind. Research compiled by psychologist Joel Norris identified several phases that serial killers go through. The first is called the aura phase.
Or it can be before the first offense. What's the fantasies that the person is having? How are these fantasies playing out? Are they writing them down anywhere? Are they videotaping themselves? Are they recording themselves? But it's really kind of the playing out of an idea in their head that's increasing in intensity about what it is that they want to satisfy. It may be sexually arousing, it may not be, depending on the kind of offender.
Becoming more antisocial as his fantasies increase and become violent sexual acts drawn from childhood, he may medicate himself with drink or drugs, but eventually reaches a point where he has to act out his fantasies. He then enters into what is known as the trolling phase.
Trolling has to do with, again, looking for location, victim type that seems or would match the person's fantasy. Let's say it's the person's fantasy involves a woman between the ages of 20 and 30, black hair, blue eyes, blonde hair, blue eyes, and then they would begin going around certain locations, certain areas to see whether or not they would have access to those types of persons. Or location, meaning far away from their home, close to their home. And then that would involve some driving around to see what they can find those kinds of persons or location. It may be trying to find a location where they can keep a victim for some time before they actually kill them.
Having gone through the process of trolling, seeking out victims and locations, the killer enters into what is identified as the wooing phase. Once the serial killer has his victim, he moves on to the next phase, known as the capture phase. Now that the victim has been successfully wooed and captured, the killer's mask finally comes off. He reveals who he really is, locking up his victim or rendering them unconscious. He is sure he is in absolute control. He is well on his way to the climax of his evil cycle of killing. In 1988, Joel Norris described the murder phase as the ritual reuniting of the killer's childhood with the roles now reversed. He is in control and can do with his victim what he will. Torture, degradation, and rape often lead up to the murder. He has depersonalized his victim, and he finally kills them.
Some offenders will want to stay with the body post-mortem after they killed the person. Then they may want to engage in some kind of sexual act. If they engage in the sexual act and it provides them some type of sexual arousal, that would be considered or in the ballpark of necrophilia.
The next phase after the murder was described by Norris as the totem phase. The killer often gathers mementos from his victims, or even body parts, in an attempt to hang on to the feeling of power and control he had.
One of the common things that we've seen with serial killers is the desire to keep trophies, to keep something that will remind them of that killing. Now, mindful of the fact that in the killing, there's a tremendous sexual gratification that takes place in the killer. And oftentimes they want to keep that in their memory bank, and they do so by taking souvenirs.
There's quite a lot of diversity, and part of that diversity may come from the way in which the individual can go about committing these very grave crimes, often involving the humiliation, suffering and torture of the victim prior to death, and often involving post-mortem activities which are also very pathological.
After the kill, the excitement is over, and the serial killer returns from his fantasy to reality. Depression is likely to set in.
Part of the reason why some of these offenders repeat again is because once they attain that behavior that matches their fantasy, they may become depressed. Not depressed in the way that you and I become depressed, but it didn't live up to what I had hoped it to be. So part of the reason why they perhaps take notes or they do videos of the offense is to further refine the behavior to meet the fantasy. So after the event, it's kind of a letdown. It wasn't as good as I thought it was, or it wasn't what I had hoped, or I didn't use that mechanism, that object, the way I wanted to because I didn't have enough time. So there's a bit of a letdown, and they'll use that to eventually feed the next preparation for the next behavioral act to occur to hopefully further meet the fantasy.
During this phase, the killer can become so depressed that he may attempt suicide. his fantasy will begin to grow and become more real. He will begin to go through these phases again as he builds up to his next kill, and the cycle repeats itself. Ted Bundy followed the path described by Norris, trolling, wooing, capturing, and murdering. Bundy admitted to 30 killings in 7 states between 1974 and 1978. He was an effective psychopathic liar, so the actual truth will never be known. It's likely he killed many more. His victims were all young women aged between 12 and 24. He was described by a member of his defense team as the very definition of heartless evil.
Ted Bundy was probably one of the most charming serial killers. When he would meet a young lady, it was very captivating. He was attractive. He was an interesting person. And oftentimes, you know, the real intelligent, which Ted Bundy was, serial killer, is such that he can engage people, convince them, you know, what he is, and the people who are his victims would be the last ones in the world to realize that they were going to be their executioner.
Jeffrey Dahmer was known as the Milwaukee Cannibal. His first victim was a male backpacker, and there followed a pattern of picking up, charming, raping, and killing young men that lasted from 1978 to 1991. He indulged in terrible necrophiliac activities, dismembering and eating his victims, keeping skulls and body parts as trophies in his house. Dahmer was eventually caught, but there was an outcry that he should have been arrested sooner. But catching a serial killer presents a tremendous challenge for law enforcement. These murders may span days, months, or even years, and can cross numerous jurisdictions. Often the relationship between suspect and victim is difficult to determine, and the motive usually remains a mystery. Investigators face enormous pressure to solve these high-profile crimes before the killer strikes again. Recently, the FBI's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime has published a special report to assist law enforcement in the apprehension of serial killers. The document studied 480 murders involving 92 different killers. The chilling report covers topics like motivation, method of killing, location of the crime, body disposal, sexual activity, and victim selection.
Many times a serial killer will pick the most accessible victim. And oftentimes in America, the most accessible victim are prostitutes. They'll approach a car, and that's all a serial killer needs.
Unlike most homicides, in the majority of serial murder cases, there is no identifiable relationship between the killer and the victims. This makes identifying the offender more problematic. The study also shows that serial killers are usually men, but they come from all races. Strangulation is the most common method of killing, and 78% of the cases involved sexual activity. In over half the cases, the killers removed multiple items from the crime scene.
The apprehension of a serial killer is a very, very difficult police task. What gives away a serial killer is the evidence that the serial killer leaves behind and or takes with him. Never have we witnessed a serial killer that doesn't leave a particular pattern. So the most difficult thing for law enforcement is the connection of one killing to another to establish the fact of serial killing.
For homicide investigators, coming to the realization that separate murders are connected and that they have a serial killer on their hands is the first step in the difficult process of detection, arrest, and conviction. Investigative techniques have advanced rapidly. Behavioral studies, suspect profiling, forensic psychology have, along with advances in DNA and forensic science, all added greatly to the investigator's arsenal. Gary Ridgway, the infamous Green River Killer, trolled for his victims in this way, picking up prostitutes in his truck and wooing them. He had sex with them and killed them, burying their bodies on the banks of the Green River in Washington state. Ridgway eluded capture for 2 decades. With the investigation stalled, the FBI accepted the offer of help from convicted killer Ted Bundy. Bundy created a profile of the killer for them. His profile turned out to be more accurate than theirs. Eventually, it was advances in DNA analysis of saliva and hair recovered from a victim that led to the arrest and subsequent conviction of Ridgway 14 years later and 20 years after his killing spree began. But even with all the advances in profiling and forensic science, chance often plays a key role in capturing the killers. Ted Bundy was pulled over for a traffic violation. A search of his vehicle uncovered an incriminating cache of burglary tools, a crowbar, a face mask, rope, and handcuffs. For Jeffrey Dahmer, it was the escape of a potential victim who chanced into a passing police car that led to his apprehension, arrest, and eventual conviction. Randy Kraft, the scorecard killer, was pulled over for drunk driving. The sleeping person in his passenger seat was actually a dead body. Today, technology advances the work of law enforcement. But technology also advances psychopathic development and activity. Solo exposure on the internet to extreme images of pornography and violence will inevitably have an effect on young and vulnerable minds.
The greater number of available media devices and the greater content that's permitted now on the internet allows an individual that's susceptible to this essentially to create their own virtual world in their room. They don't have to leave their room. So if they have these kinds of fantasies, ideas, they can actually create a world within their home that supports those ideas.
Recently, online activity has been used by serial killers to achieve their goals. In a recent case in the United Kingdom, Stephen Port engaged in the serial killer's traditional behavioral activities of trolling and wooing entirely online. Over a period of time, he lured 4 young men to his flat, drugged them, raped them, and brutally murdered them. He dumped their bodies in a nearby churchyard and arrogantly called the police to tell them they were there. He exhibited all the traits of a psychopathic serial killer and showed no remorse.
Criminal offenders, repeat offenders, are early adapters of new technology. They tend to pick it up and use it, so they try to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. So the game, I guess, is changing a lot.
So despite the scientific and technological giant steps that have been made, we still have a lot to learn about the criminal mind. We learn more about the human brain every day, but the nature versus nurture debate still continues. Perhaps we are only slightly closer to understanding what makes a man evil.
What makes a man evil is extraordinarily complex and probably a question that's been asked since the beginning of time. You know, when I first got into this business of studying criminal minds in the 70s, I thought at some point we'd turn a corner and things would get better. But it seems as though it's getting worse and worse and worse.